Arbor Day is the day and kind of month that we celebrate trees in the lived environment. And so today we're just going to kind of celebrate some of the species we have in our community. So we're going to come over here. It's interesting with trees because sometimes they're the big ones. When they're mature, you often can't reach the leaves, and the leaves are often the best way to identify a species. So this one happens to have some sprouting lower down, so it's a great example of understanding what the tree might look like in its full glory, but then also being able to poke at the leaves. I think I'll start with sort of talk about some of the things to pay attention to with any tree before we even name this one. I'm going to rip off just one leaf. So the leaf is your key way of understanding how to identify most species from each other. And there's a couple of details here that I'm going to draw your attention to. One of them is the edge of the leaf sometimes has these little knife edges, and other times it'll be very smooth. And so we call it serration, kind of like a serrated knife is what those jagged edges are. And so based on whether a leaf has smooth edges or jagged edges, that can be a key way to narrow down which species it might be. The other factor we have here is whether there's big lobes or if it's just a nice smooth shape all the way around. And so we call each of these kind of broader kind of spear points, we call that a lobe. And so there's a couple of lobes on this leaf. There's just one leaflet. So I have one stem here, or petiole, and there's some species that will have multiple leaflets coming off the single petiole. And here we just have one. So those are three identification traits that help us, is the texture kind of the margin of the leaf, which is serrated here. It's got a lobed shape instead of like an entire kind of simple shape. And then it's got a single leaf per petiole. And so each of the trees we'll go along here will kind of identify, amongst those types of traits, which category it might fall into. So I'm sure someone here knows, if you want to shout out the species.
Well, okay. It's a red maple.
It's a red maple.
Yeah.
Yep, so classic tree, historically very sort of valued for kind of street tree planting, largely for its beautiful red color in the fall. Obviously it's in the spring now, so they're green like other species, but red maples give us a really satisfying, brilliant red in the fall. Also tends to be pretty urban tough. It can be problematic if it's too close to like a foundation or a like pavement, because they do have more of a surface-rooted habit as opposed to kind of slightly deeper roots. And so there are locations where it's maybe not the right tree in the right place, but generally they do pretty well in the city. Jojo, you want to hold this leaf here? It can be yours. Yeah. It can be just for you.
What do you say? What do you say?
You're welcome. That's a red maple leaf. So unfortunately I don't think we're gonna come across the other key native maples on this walk, but the problem with identification can become when trees are very similar. And the look-alike for red maple is gonna be silver maple. And the key difference is just that those lobes on the silver maple are much longer, much kind of deeper. Whereas the red maple has the lobes, but they're kind of a little less pronounced. The other maples would be sugar and Norway maple, and those do not have serrations on the margins. And so if you've got those knife teeth on the edge, you know it's either going to be a red or a silver maple, generally. Whenever I say generalizations like that, there's always going to be some foreign maple from Japan or something that breaks whatever rule I'm going to say. But generally speaking, certainly in the woods, if you're seeing serrations on the leaf margins, then you're probably looking at a red or a silver maple. Obviously, a food product that we all love is maple syrup. Sugar maple is the species that has the highest sugar content in its sap, but red maple does have a sugar content that's turnable into maple syrup, and it does have the same cycle where in the spring when you have those freeze-thaw back and forths between the winter and spring, you'll get that pressure buildup that will push the sap out. Just throw a tap in there and you'll start getting sap. It'll take a lot more sap to boil down to something close to maple syrup for a red maple than for a sugar maple. I think sugar maple is like 2 to 3% sugar content, and red maple is closer to like 1 or 1.5. That's a long ago memory, but I think it's kind of on that order. Does anyone know?
No, I don't
Does it
remember.
hurt the tree? Or
Um,
what does it do to the tree?
Yeah, I mean, technically it's part of its carbohydrates that it would have used to grow more. There are trees that people have been tapping for decades and are doing just fine. I think generally speaking, you're going to retain a healthy tree. I'd say if a tree was already stressed, probably wouldn't be tapping it. Maybe if it's growing in a non-ideal location, wouldn't be tapping it. My mom, she's got a red maple as a street tree in front of her house, and she tapped it with one tap in a bucket for I think 2 years, just for fun, just to see what would happen, and tree was fine.
And they have to be mature before you can start doing that?
Yeah, I mean mature is it's a flexible term. I'm not sure at what age the recommended sort of tapping would start. I don't really recommend tapping your trees, but it's just interesting to be aware of those details. I think we were going to move over to, I do want to get to the leaves. This is a fun one. Here we have actually a close relative of the maples. We break up our species into kind of these categories of how closely related they are. And the second level up from a species, we call it genus. And so the maple genus, or in Latin you say it Acer, A-C-E-R, kind of like the computer, Acer. If you're in the same genus, that means you're very closely related. And so this tree is in the same genus as the maples. And it'll look pretty different, which is why it's interesting to jump to this one next. I'll just jump and say this looks a lot like poison ivy, especially when you get these leaves that just have 3 leaflets. Because box elder, if you look higher up, often it'll have 5. But when they're younger, they can have 3 leaflets as well. But knowing it's not poison ivy, does anybody want to maybe call out some of the similarities or some of the characteristics based on what we discussed before, describing the leaf here?
Well, it's a little bit serrated at the top.
Yep. So I'd say coarsely serrated as opposed to finely serrated is the term I'd use. Good. And knowing this is all one leaf, anything else you'd say about what I'm holding?
It's got 3 leaves. They have 3.
3 leaflets. Yep, yep. So just like I held up that one petiole earlier, one leaf stem, before we just had one sort of mass of leaf coming off it. Here we have 3, which there aren't that many species that have, or there are much fewer species that have what we call compound leaves, so multiple leaflets per leaf. And so that's a way to really narrow down what species it might be. And one last piece on understanding this kind of like compound leaf versus regular leaf is that this whole petiole will drop off in the fall. You know, instead of each of these leaflets dropping off, it'll all drop off as one from the main stem. And if you look closely, you can even see the scars from where in past seasons, a leaf dropped off. Once you get into kind of advanced tree ID, leaf scars can be, on the stem can be an identification trait. And the last thing I didn't mention, I'll kind of add a new characteristic to be aware of. You know, we talked about the leaf margins, we talked about how many leaflets on the leaf. Another thing is how the leaves are oriented along the stem. And there's 2 main ways they can be oriented. They can either be alternating kind of along, like as if I had an arm that came out from my hip, and one arm from the shoulder, that would be alternating. Or they can be coming out at the same location, like my arms actually do. They kind of on either side of my body come out at the same spot. And we call that oppositely oriented. So alternate, opposite. And if you look closely at this whole stem, which way would you say these leaflets are coming off? Anybody want to give a guess? Opposite. Exactly. So that's a characteristic of the maple family or genus, is that the leaves will come off the stem in an opposite orientation. And just like we talked about with the compound leaf nature being rarer, it's also rarer to have opposite orientation. So I'd basically say if you have oppositely oriented and it's a compound leaf, you could almost be certain it's a box elder. Certainly if it's a big tree, I would say that's pretty close. Well, sorry, also ash.
Yeah. Ash.
So the mnemonic for that, the sort of tool to remember that I learned in arborist school was MAD, Cap, Horse, which MAD is the acronym of maple, ash, dogwood. Cap is the genus of Caprifoliaceae, and horse is horse chestnut. So if anybody wants to go home and become an arborist, that you can learn your madcap horse, and if you know each of those would be all the most of the oppositely oriented species. So box elder, sometimes considered a weedy species. They kind of grow wherever they want. They kind of will grow off and search the light and be this gangly, leaning structure. I kind of like a species that's a contender, that can kind of grow anywhere, that kind of perseveres. And so one person's weed is another person's, fighter, like successful, kind of commendable species. Yeah, not the longest lived tree. It's not one that you'd maybe want growing over your porch. Slightly weaker wood, but sort of at the edge, a little further from a structure. I think they're lovely.
Are they often found near water, or is this just how it happens?
Yeah, I'd say in the wild, definitely. Sort of like stream-side species. You'll notice some of these species that are kind of really good at reaching out over streams. For sun, like they work well along streams because they can kind of like get a little further towards the center of the stream where there's more light. Whereas 30 feet back, you might have an oak canopy or something like that. And so that can be sort of a characteristic that I've always associated with some of these species. Elm would be one as well. That's good at kind of like leaning out, or sycamore. All right. Well, let's move along. So a tree that I just mentioned. One of our giants of our area. And then this broken trunk as well is going to be the same species. The thing that jumps out most on it, if someone looks up, is there any sort of key interesting features that you see on, maybe not the leaf, but on the wood?
But the branches don't start so very high up.
Well, that's a good point. Yep. This is, we'd say this is sort of a mature tree that's become a canopy upper story tree. And we've had some concern when people when we do our street tree pruning, or we're doing clearance pruning to elevate the crowns. And some people can be concerned that we're cutting off these lower branches. And then I have to explain that a lot of these species, what they're going for is to be a canopy tree, and you don't see barely any branches starting until 50 feet up. And so, yeah, great example of what some of our canopy trees that are young are hopefully going to be in the future. Yeah, so the key, one of the...
I would say, in answer to your question, the bark seems to fall off the higher up you get.
Yeah, kind of a flaky, yeah, for sure. And then once you get further up there, very smooth, a very smooth bark. So if this tree was younger, maybe in the kind of 6 to 10 inch range, you'd be able to see this creamy, kind of like off-green, sort of pale cream color, and very smooth, very like someone sanded it down. And then as the tree gets older, that smoothness transitions to this very sort of fine, blocky texture. You can kind of see down here, yeah, like little, almost like someone like glued on a bunch of little Lego blocks. And so very characteristic of sycamore, which is the species here, the American sycamore. There are a couple other trees with that smooth look. Not really many that get to this size though. It's a little thin at the top. It is a hard time of year to really be certain about the health of a tree to the untrained eye, because the leaves are still coming out. They're still emerging. Sycamore can suffer from an anthracnose disease, which can kind of stunt both the twig growth, twig elongation. It can actually also lead to early leaf drop, where all the leaves will drop off and you'll think your tree is dead, but it'll actually flush out a new set of leaves. And so I've had people call in and say, "Oh, my tree's dying, I'm so concerned." And I say, give it a month, and you may find that your tree's actually, a little stressed, but certainly not on its last leg. And it's a condition that the tree can kind of persist with for a while, maybe 10, 20 years, if not longer. I do have a leaf over here that is from last season, so it's not quite as good. So if you can kind of picture that being a green leaf and without crinkly cuts in it. We've got some similarities to our first tree, the maple. We have these lobes that almost look like they could be a maple. We don't have the serrations, so you have a smooth edge to the leaf. And then you've got kind of like almost more lobes. It's somewhere between a lobe and a serration where you've got these kind of pokes, which is not characteristic of maple. You know, usually you'll have, the serrations will be very fine and the lobes will be more distinct. So this is kind of more of an intermediate kind of, is that a lobe, is that a serration? Also larger than our maple leaves usually are. A Norway maple leaf might get almost this big, but you know, they are different. And one of those things would be these kind of extra little pokers coming out. So that's a very crude decaying sycamore leaf for you. And then if you're really uncertain if you've got a Norway maple or a sycamore leaf in your hand, and if it's a fresh leaf, what you can do is you can break open the leaf stem, and for a Norway maple, you get this latex kind of like white goo will kind of goo out from either the leaf stem or from the leaf itself. And if that happens, then you'll be pretty sure you've got a Norway maple leaf in your hand, not a sycamore leaf.
How about, I got confused between I think it was a sugar maple and a Norway maple.
Yeah.
Would that work on that?
Yep. Sugar maple does not have that white latex. It'll be like an opaque, very light white color, kind of a pure white. So yeah, that's one of the key identification traits for Norway versus sugar. We could go on more about that, but we don't have those in front of us. So there are a couple other tricks. The buds are actually a really good differentiator between Norway and sugar maple if you have a leaf bud in your hand. We're not talking about buds today because a lot of the buds have broken open and the new ones for next season haven't formed yet. So normally for those fine differentiations between closely related species, the look of the bud can be really helpful. So this is actually a really challenging time of year for that kind of more advanced identification, but we're not even going there today, so no buds today. So yeah, sycamore is kind of our giant of the riverside. If you go along like over by the C&O Canal, Great Falls area, you'll just see these giant sycamores down in kind of the floodplain area. Really impressive trees, provide great canopy, are also pretty tough in the urban environment, minus the anthracnose sort of condition. You do find that species that are more adapted to often waterlogged conditions or like clay conditions tend to be the species that work better in our urban soils, because we also have this compacted soil which also kind of has that like low oxygen condition. You know, waterlogging can reduce the oxygen availability, and then compacting soil can also reduce the oxygen availability. So it's just one of those sort of quirks that we find that we're often looking to those riverside trees that, you know, those species for our urban plantings. A good example of that is, at the opposite end, is the opposite of sort of waterside would be like, you know, hilltops and uplands. And we have a lot of chestnut oaks in the city, and those are the ones that have been faring kind of worst against some of this oak decline we've been seeing. And you know, my understanding is that they're just those chestnut oaks are just not adapted to deal with waterlogged soils. So if you have a protracted period of kind of too much rain for a couple weeks or a month or two, they're going to take on a lot more stress from kind of that low oxygen condition. So unfortunately, a lot of the chestnut oaks are kind of on their last leg. And it's all about your tolerance. You know, are you a species that can handle a little more stress, can bounce back after kind of regrowing those fine root hairs, or are you a species that isn't really adapted to that?
How long do they live?
Yeah, you know, I often get that question. People will say, "Oh, so how old is that tree?" And you know, it's hard to know on a given tree. Generally speaking, a sycamore can be very long-lived. I think upwards of 300-400 years in ideal conditions. You know, so in the urban environment, we're going to get maybe shorter lifespans. But you know, there are plenty of sycamores in the city that are well over 100 years old. Yeah, you know, in Takoma Park, we really prioritize retention of our canopy trees. So we want to, you know, it's really hard to regrow a tree like this in any reasonable time frame. Preservation, you know, really should be a high priority. And we have tree protection laws where going through this process that I like to think of it not just as sort of, you know, a rigid regulation that, you know, you don't like. It's actually kind of a service where you apply for the tree impact assessment before you even, you know, finalize your plans. I come out and we'll have a chat on the property about, you know, what trees are there, how the design could be adjusted to best preserve the trees. Taking tree health and structure into account at the beginning of these projects is really key. Yeah, we try to make the awareness of that very high in the city, and we also have this process through which you'll get my review, again, hopefully that's seen as a bit of a service to kind of have that input on the project. In the end, I'm also requiring you to stick by what I say, so it's kind of a carrot and a stick. Yeah. So that's sycamore for you. Ooh, one of my favorites. Pass one that way, and then one this way. And then, based on some of the traits we've been looking at with the other species, does someone want to call out some identifying features about this leaf?
Doesn't have any lobes.
No lobes. Yep, so we call that an entire edge instead of lobing.
Ruffled.
Yeah, rough, serrated is the word we'd use. So I would say very finely serrated in this case, much finer than the red maple even had.
Only one leaflet.
Only one leaflet, so yeah, it's a simple leaf instead of a compound leaf. If you look at where the whole new stems are coming out, that's probably more helpful than trying to look at each of the small leaflets. You can see that each location only has one bud that broke instead of two. So we'd call that alternately arranged leafing or branching pattern. So unfortunately, these traits, a lot of species have exactly these traits. You know, serrated edges, simple leaf, alternate, no lobes. So we need to look at a couple other features of the tree to know what it is. And this species, the bark is going to be our key identification trait after kind of checking the other items. And so I wanted to get to a bigger example because it's more pronounced, but you'll find these like weird sort of like ridges that are sort of vertically oriented, and kind of these bumps and almost like bumps and valleys along the bark, the trunk of the tree. It's almost like the sinews of like a muscle, the kind of way those muscles will overlap. If you saw like an anatomical drawing of a muscle, might seem like an odd way to look at it, but it's helpful because one of the names for this tree is musclewood. And there's a couple names, musclewood. What I call it is American hornbeam, horn like a rhinoceros horn.
I think even blue beech.
Blue beech is another one because of the very smooth, lighter gray. It is, and also the kind of the texture is quite similar to American beech. I don't know where the blue came from. I don't see blue in it. These species have been used for generations, thousands of years by local communities. That each of them kind of came up with their name that felt most appropriate. And you know, I don't like to think of it as if there's one right name. You know, from a scientific perspective, it's nice to be able to have that as a tool, but to also kind of appreciate all the different people that came up with fun names for a tree after living and working with it for years. As far as that's concerned, this species is interesting for how dense the wood is. It's a very high density. You know, if you lift up a piece of American hornbeam wood or musclewood, you'll feel it's very heavy. And very fine texture of the grain as well, so it's very prized for like turning. You could like almost like make like kind of pre-industrialization, you know, making like little machines out of wooden parts. You could make out of this wood. Also, kind of like our box elder, it's going to be kind of an understory riverside species. and I think they're lovely. I think it's a good smaller stature tree of our native trees. That if you have a shady area in the yard, that could work well. They also do pretty well in shade. One more tree to do, which is a classic. I guess we'll do the same exercise here. We'll pass around some leaves. I'm gonna take that.
Okay. 4 people looking at.
And you can just look closely at the ones in front of you too.
It's like the leaf is so much like that.
Does anybody want to try their hand at some of the traits we've been talking about as far as the margins and the lobes?
Serrated margin.
Serrated margins. Any more comment on the type of serration there? If you look closely, like compared to the other ones, how would you use other words to describe it?
Well, one thing, it goes all the way to the bottom. One of those, I can't remember which one now. It only started part way out.
I find American elm very, very regular serrations.
You just gave us the name.
Oh, sorry, I'm bad.
I think it's an American elm.
So you have very regular, almost like an artist kind of went in and did like a very like mathematically sort of consistent look there. So single leaflet, so it's not a compound leaf. If you look at the branches there, alternately arranged. Interesting features, if you look at the base of the leaf, the two sides of the leaf don't match at the petiole in the same location. One goes a little further than the other. Only a couple species that do that. The two that I think of off the top of my head. Around here, yeah.
Around here, this seems to be the only one.
Yeah. And linden, well, I guess those are also. A linden leaf would be more heart-shaped, more kind of wide, whereas the comparatively, the American elm's a little more slender. You also have that interesting kind of swooping to a point. There's almost this kind of like parabola that happens as you approach the tip of the leaf for an American elm. As they get more mature, you'll feel like a sandpapery texture on the underside. The young leaves don't really have that yet. And then on the bark, we have kind of a corky texture. If you kind of push on it, you'll get a little spongy feel. I don't recommend peeling it off, but if you have maybe a dead American elm, the bark has what I was taught is ham and cheese look, where you'll have kind of alternating layers of kind of like a chestnut brown with a lighter kind of cheese color. So ham and cheese is what we learned that as. The bark it's kind of almost like a yellowed sort of color that, to my eye, stands out amongst our native trees. Again, in the wild is a riverside species, also good at growing in the city. We do have Dutch elm disease, which is our key concern as far as disease pressure. And then there's the history of earlier in the 1900s and maybe late 1800s, this tree was certainly overplanted. We'd have these long alleys and like blocks and blocks of just a single species in our urban areas. And it was a great example of when monoculture does not serve sort of durability and resilience in an urban forest. So we really want to maximize diversity of species that we're planting. You know, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't give a certain insect or pathogen, you know, just a feast of exactly what it wants, because you're just going to create that multiplying effect of that pathogen or insect being able to just totally take over. So we're trying to do less of that sort of single alley of plantings now. So that's American elm. Obviously, it's a lovely landscape tree. You know, when they're open grown and with enough space and sun, they just have a great form, this kind of like vase shape. So it makes sense why it was prized as a street tree and as a landscape tree. But you know, plant in moderation is what I would say. Thanks for coming out. Happy Arbor Day and happy Earth Day.